The Rhine River in 12 AD marked the bleeding edge of the Roman Empire, a frontier where civilization gave way to wilderness and the ever-present threat of Germanic tribes. In the military camps that dotted this volatile border, life was defined by discipline, dirt, and the grim reality of potential violence. Into this harsh, masculine world came a small boy who would become both its product and its eventual master. His name was Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus, but to the legionaries who adored him, he was known by another name altogether, Caligula, or Little Boots, a nickname born from the miniature military boots his mother made him wear. This seemingly trivial detail, the choice of footwear, would define his early life and foreshadow his complex relationship with power. His mother, Agrippina the Elder, was no ordinary Roman matron. As the granddaughter of Emperor Augustus and wife of the legendary General Germanicus, she possessed both impeccable lineage and formidable political ambition. Dressing her young son in a perfect replica of a legionary's uniform was a calculated act of political theater. It presented Gaius as a child of the army, a symbol of military tradition, who could connect with the common soldier in a way the aristocracy in Rome never could. The effect was immediate and profound. The battle-hardened legionaries, men who had known little but war and hardship, found their hearts captured by this serious-faced toddler who marched earnestly beside his father's troops. He became the camp's mascot, lifted onto the shoulders of grizzled centurions, fed morsels from their simple campfire meals, and learning the rough, practical Latin of the ranks rather than the polished rhetoric of the Roman elite. His playground was the parade ground. His toys were wooden swords and miniature shields. This unique upbringing forged an unbreakable bond between the boy and the army, a connection that would later become one of the foundational pillars of his power. His father, Germanicus Julius Caesar, represented everything Rome admired in a leader. Tall, charismatic, brilliantly strategic, and genuinely beloved by his troops, he seemed to embody the virtues of an earlier, purer Rome. The historian Tacitus would later describe him as possessing a singular humanity and a remarkable power of winning men's souls. His soldiers didn't just follow him. They worshipped him with a devotion that bordered on religious fervor. Yet this varied popularity created a dangerous political dynamic. The sitting emperor, Tiberius Germanicus's uncle and adoptive father, watched his nephew's growing fame with deepening suspicion and resentment. In the paranoid world of imperial politics, excellence itself could be a death sentence. For young Caligula, those first years were a strange but wondrous existence, a martial idol that shielded him from the political storms gathering around his family. But the shelter proved temporary. The first major crack in his world appeared in 14 AD with the death of his great-grandfather, Emperor Augustus. The Rhine legions, fiercely loyal to Germanicus above any other authority, saw the transition of power as an opportunity to air their grievances. They mutinied, demanding better pay and conditions, and some units went even further, proposing to proclaim Germanicus emperor on the spot. This moment presented Germanicus with an impossible choice: seize power and plunge Rome into civil war, or reaffirm his loyalty to the suspicious Tiberius. In what demonstrated either profound principle or shrewd political calculation, historians still debate which Germanicus chose loyalty. He quelled the rebellion, but in doing so, undoubtedly marked his family for even greater scrutiny from the emperor. The political noose was tightening, though young Caligula, perhaps too young to understand the complexities, could only sense the growing tension around him. The true catastrophe, the event that would shatter Caligula's world and set him on his dark path, arrived in 19 AD. Germanicus was sent to reorganize Rome's eastern provinces, a prestigious assignment that took the family through the ancient, wealthy cities of the East, a world of Greek philosophy and Eastern opulence far removed from the stark German camps. But in the cosmopolitan city of Antioch, the heart of Roman administration in Syria, Germanicus fell violently and mysteriously ill. The symptoms were horrific and unmistakable to any Roman. A burning fever, painful ulcers covering his body, and a slow, agonizing weakening that pointed to one conclusion: poison. The word spread through the city like a plague. On his deathbed, Germanicus gathered his closest friends. In a voice weakened by pain, but sharp with conviction, he accused Gnaeus Calpurnius Piso, the governor of Syria and a known ally of Emperor Tiberius, of orchestrating his murder. According to Tacitus, Germanicus believed the orders came from the highest level, reportedly saying to those gathered around him, "If my life were ending naturally, I would have a legitimate grievance against the gods for tearing me away from my parents, children, and country." The death of Germanicus wasn't merely a family tragedy. It was a national trauma that reverberated throughout the empire. When news reached Rome, the public grief was overwhelming and genuine. The people felt they had lost not just a general, but a potential savior, a man who might have restored what they saw as Rome's fading glory. For the 7-year-old Caligula, it was the end of his world as he knew it. The strong, heroic father who formed the center of his universe had been taken not in glorious combat, but through what appeared to be a cowardly, clandestine act of political betrayal. The lesson was seared into his young psyche with the heat of the funeral pyre. The world was not governed by honor or virtue, but by poison and hidden daggers. Trust, he learned, was fatal. He returned to Rome with his mother, no longer just a boy, but a walking symbol of his father's martyrdom. The people showered him with affection, but their love felt like a heavy, painful mantle. Every cheer was a reminder of the father he had lost. Every sympathetic glance reflected the enemies he believed had taken him. And those enemies, he would soon learn, were very real and very powerful. His mother, Agrippina the Elder, now became the focal point and public face of the opposition to Tiberius. Proud, fierce, and politically astute, she openly mourned her husband and made no secret of her belief that Tiberius was responsible for his death. She represented the last bastion of the popular, charismatic branch of the imperial family, and Tiberius, along with his powerful and equally ambitious Praetorian prefect, Sejanus, saw her and her children not just as political opponents, but as existential threats that needed to be systematically eliminated. What followed was a slow, brutal, and methodical political massacre that Caligula witnessed firsthand as he grew from a bereaved child into a traumatized young man. He watched as his mother's friends and supporters were arrested on trumped-up charges of treason. He saw the once vibrant and politically connected Agrippina become increasingly isolated, desperate, and paranoid in a Rome where informers, called delators, operated at every level of society. A careless word at a dinner party, an unguarded comment in the baths, a critical remark about the emperor overheard by the wrong person, any of these could lead to exile, confiscation of property, or execution. The atmosphere was thick with fear, and young Caligula breathed it in every day. The final, devastating blows fell in quick and brutal succession. First, his eldest brother, Nero Caesar, was arrested on fabricated charges and exiled to the remote, desolate island of Pontia. Then his mother, Agrippina, was herself dragged away from her home. The historian Tacitus recorded her desperate, theatrical cry as she was taken, a moment of high drama that highlighted her defiance. She pointed to her womb and screamed that it had borne Tiberius's heir, a reference to Caligula himself. It was a futile, heartbreaking appeal to whatever conscience the emperor might possess. She was exiled to the barren island of Pandateria, a rocky, windswept place where political prisoners were sent to be forgotten. The stories that later emerged from that grim outpost were chilling. A centurion was sent to persuade her to end her own life. When she refused, he beat her so savagely that she lost an eye. Ultimately, stripped of all other means of resistance, she chose self-starvation as her final act of defiance, refusing to give Tiberius the satisfaction of a formal execution. His other brother, Drusus Caesar, met an even more horrifying and prolonged fate. He was imprisoned in the basement of the imperial palace on Rome's Palatine Hill, the very heart of the power that was destroying his family. Kept in darkness and fed minimal, degrading rations, he slowly starved. The rumors that seeped out of the palace into the city's gossip mills were the stuff of nightmares. That in his final days, maddened by hunger and isolation, he had been reduced to eating the stuffing from his mattress before he finally died, alone and forgotten. Now imagine, if you can, the developing psyche of the young man who survived this systematic destruction of his entire family. Caligula had lost his father to what he firmly believed was political poison, his mother to brutal beating and self-imposed starvation, his brothers to imprisonment and slow, agonizing deaths. He had gone from the beloved son of Rome's greatest hero to the last surviving son of a systematically destroyed family, a political pawn in a court of corpses. The education he received during his formative years wasn't in philosophy, rhetoric, or statecraft, but in terror, betrayal, and the absolute precariousness of power and life itself. The only lessons this brutal curriculum could have taught him were stark, simple, and terrible. Trust is suicide, mercy is a fatal weakness, and power raw, absolute, unforgiving power is the only true shield, the only guarantee of survival against the world's inherent cruelty. Somehow he endured. He was the last boy standing in a family that had been methodically erased from existence. And his survival required what must have been a monstrous act of psychological self-preservation, a hardening of the heart that would have profound consequences for the Roman world. In a final, bitterly ironic twist of fate, he was taken into the household of the very man he must have believed had murdered his family, the Emperor Tiberius, who had by now retreated entirely from public view to his lavish, decadent, and deeply paranoid villa on the beautiful but morally corrupt cliffside of Capri. Capri in the late 20s AD was a place of stunning natural beauty and profound moral corruption. Emperor Tiberius had abandoned Rome for this island paradise, creating a court that combined Greek intellectualism with every imaginable vice. The villas perched on cliffs overlooking the azure Mediterranean housed not just an emperor, but a man increasingly consumed by paranoia and depravity. It was into this environment that the teenage Caligula arrived, a survivor of familial annihilation now forced to live under the roof of his presumed tormentor. The Caligula who came to Capri was a master of deception. The cheerful little boots of the German camps had been buried alive, replaced by a carefully constructed persona of harmless subservience. He understood that his survival depended on convincing Tiberius and his network of informers that he was no threat. The historian Philo of Alexandria, who would later meet Caligula, noted his extraordinary ability to play the most excellent of slaves, a performance so convincing it masked the seething rage and ambition beneath. Life in Tiberius's court was a daily lesson in psychological warfare. The emperor, now in his late 60s and early 70s, had become increasingly capricious and cruel. He maintained power through a sophisticated system of informants who reported every real or imagined slight. Caligula watched as men were elevated one day and destroyed the next based on Tiberius's whims. He witnessed the emperor's sexual perversions firsthand. The young boys kept as catamites, the secret rooms where every depravity was indulged. This was his education in absolute power. He learned that authority derived not from justice or merit, but from the ability to instill fear and control desire. The young prince perfected his mask of mediocrity. He avoided political discussions, showed no interest in governance, and carefully concealed his intelligence. When his toga caught on a door, causing a senator to laugh, Caligula laughed along, reinforcing his image as a clumsy, unthreatening youth. He participated in Tiberius's debaucheries without complaint or enthusiasm, becoming a ghost at the feast. All the while, he was studying, analyzing, memorizing every weakness, every vulnerability in the system that had destroyed his family. Tiberius was not fooled. The old emperor possessed a keen political instinct honed over decades of survival. He recognized the danger in his great-nephew. Roman historians preserve several of his alleged remarks about Caligula. "I am nurturing a viper for the Roman people," and more ominously, "Gaius will live to destroy both himself and all men." Yet he took no action against the young man, perhaps seeing in him a reflection of his own damaged youth, or perhaps believing he could control the threat. The dynamic between them was captured in a famous exchange. When a courtier asked Caligula how he endured life in this toxic environment, he reportedly replied with a quiet, knowing smile, "Because I was caring for a wolf." The metaphor was perfect. He was the keeper of a dangerous predator, tending to it while ensuring it didn't turn and devour him, all while waiting for nature to take its course. For nearly 7 years, this deadly dance continued. Caligula moved through the marble halls of Capri like a phantom, his true self hidden behind layers of deception. Then, in 37 AD, the waiting ended. Tiberius, now 77 years old, left Capri for the first time in a decade, traveling to a villa in Misenum on the Italian mainland. There, he fell gravely ill. The political world held its breath. The succession was uncertain. Tiberius had shown no clear preference for an heir, and several potential candidates existed. But one man saw his opportunity and seized it. Naedius Sutorius Macro, the Praetorian prefect who had replaced the executed Sejanus. Macro recognized that his power depended on backing the winning successor, and he calculated that Caligula, despite his youth, was the strongest candidate. The young prince had the army's affection because of his father's legacy, the people's sympathy because of his family's tragedy, and the Senate's cautious support as an alternative to continued Tiberian rule. Macro ensured Caligula was at the dying emperor's bedside, positioning him as the natural successor. Then came the dramatic incident that would become legendary. Tiberius appeared to die. He stopped breathing, and the court began celebrating Caligula's accession. But suddenly, the old emperor stirred, sat up, and called for food. The room froze in terror. The succession, seemingly settled moments before, was now in jeopardy. According to the historian Suetonius, it was Macro who resolved the crisis with brutal finality. He entered the room, took a pile of heavy blankets, and smothered Tiberius until he was truly dead. Whether this dramatic story is factual or political propaganda, the outcome was certain. On March 16, 37 AD, Tiberius was dead, and Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus, the 24-year-old survivor known to the world as Caligula, became the third Roman emperor. The viper had emerged from the wolf's den, and now the entire empire was his territory. The news triggered an explosion of joy throughout Rome. After 23 years of Tiberius's grim, reclusive rule, the people desperately wanted a change. In Caligula, they saw not a traumatized survivor but a savior. He was the beloved son of Germanicus returned, the last scion of a noble line, the handsome young prince who would restore the golden age of Augustus. The contrast with Tiberius could not have been more striking: youth versus age, openness versus secrecy, potential versus stagnation. Caligula's journey from Misenum to Rome was a triumphal procession. Crowds lined the roads, cheering themselves hoarse. When he entered the city on March 28th, the celebration reached fever pitch. The Senate, swept up in the popular enthusiasm and eager to curry favor, voted him all imperial powers in a single day, setting aside traditional constitutional formalities. They weren't just appointing an emperor, they were crowning a messiah. For his first 7 months, Caligula performed the role of the perfect prince with breathtaking skill. He was everything the people had hoped for: generous, accessible, compassionate, and politically astute. He began by publicly healing the wounds his family had suffered. He sailed to the islands where his mother and brother Nero had died, and collected their ashes with solemn reverence. The image of the young emperor personally carrying the urns of his martyred family members back to Rome was powerfully symbolic. He interred them in the mausoleum of Augustus with the full estate honors, a cathartic moment for the entire populace that seemed to close a painful chapter in Roman history. His policies were masterstrokes of populism. He granted a generous bonus to the Praetorian Guard, securing the loyalty of the military. He recalled all exiles who had been banished under Tiberius, emptying the prisons of political detainees. In one of his most celebrated acts, he gathered the secret files of Tiberius's informers and had them burned in the Forum Romanum, publicly declaring that he would not read them. and that his reign would be one of transparency and trust. The sense of relief among the aristocracy was palpable. A cloud of fear had been lifted. He abolished the deeply unpopular 1% sales tax, endearing himself to merchants and the common people alike. He staged spectacular games, theatrical performances, and gladiatorial contests, spending the vast treasury over 2.7 billion sesterces that the frugal Tiberius had accumulated. He restored certain powers to the popular assemblies and was remarkably accessible, often mingling with ordinary citizens. The Jewish philosopher Philo, who saw him during this period, described him as a savior and benefactor, a beacon of hope after long darkness. But beneath the surface of this golden prince, the damage of his traumatic past was festering. The performance, though flawless, was just that, a performance. The man who had learned in the most brutal way possible to trust no one was now the most trusted man in Rome. The man who understood power as a tool for personal survival was now expected to wield it for the public good. The pressure of maintaining this flawless facade, of living up to these messianic expectations, must have been immense. And then, about 6 months into his reign, something broke. In October of 37 AD, Caligula fell catastrophically ill. The nature of the sickness remains unknown. Some historians speculate it was encephalitis or a nervous breakdown. Others suggest the falling sickness, epilepsy, that ran in the Julian family. Whatever its cause, the illness was severe, and for several weeks, his survival was genuinely in doubt. The people of Rome were plunged into despair. They offered fervent prayers and sacrifices for his recovery. Suetonius records that some citizens vowed to fight as gladiators themselves if the emperor's life was spared, while others promised to give their own lives in exchange for his. The intensity of the public reaction reflected how completely they had invested their hopes in this young ruler. When Caligula finally emerged from his sick room, the Sun King was gone. Something fundamental had shattered during his illness. The man who returned to public life was not the same man who had been carried away months earlier. Whether the illness caused physical brain damage, broke the psychological dam holding back his trauma, or simply convinced him of his own invincibility after cheating death, the result was the same. The viper that Tiberius had identified was now fully awake, and his reign of terror was about to begin. The performance was over. The monster was taking the stage. Caligula's emergence from his near-fatal illness marked a definitive turning point in his reign and personality. The benevolent young ruler who had captured Rome's heart seemed to have died during his sickness, replaced by a capricious and increasingly cruel tyrant. The first visible sign of this transformation was his physical appearance. Where he had previously been robust and energetic, he now looked pale and haggard. But the more alarming changes were psychological. The emperor who returned to public life displayed new levels of paranoia and grandiosity. He began speaking of his survival as proof of divine favor, then gradually shifted to suggesting he was divine himself. This wasn't merely ego. It was the manifestation of profound psychological damage. The man who had survived the destruction of his entire family now seemed to believe he could only be safe if he transcended humanity altogether. His financial policies revealed the first practical consequences of this shift. The vast treasury of 2.7 billion sesterces accumulated by Tiberius, enough to fund the entire Roman army for years, began vanishing at an alarming rate. Caligula's spending became legendary and reckless. He ordered the construction of 2 massive pleasure barges for Lake Nemi, floating palaces complete with marble floors, heating systems, and elaborate decorations. These weren't practical vessels, but floating monuments to excess, measuring over 70 meters long, the largest ships in the ancient world. But the spending spree extended far beyond personal luxury. He initiated massive building projects throughout Rome, including a new aqueduct and expanded imperial palace. He revived lavish public games on an unprecedented scale, once staging a single spectacle that consumed the entire annual grain supply in a matter of days. When advisors warned him about the draining treasury, he reportedly replied, "A man should either be frugal or be Caesar," suggesting that ordinary rules didn't apply to him. The financial pressure soon led to increasingly desperate measures. He began manipulating the legal system to confiscate wealthy citizens' property, reviving the hated practice of treason trials that he had earlier abolished. He imposed new taxes on everything from food to legal proceedings to prostitution. Most notoriously, he reportedly turned part of the imperial palace into a brothel, employing senators' wives and upper-class women to serve as customers, with the proceeds flowing directly to his coffers. His relationship with the Senate deteriorated rapidly. Where he had initially shown respect, he now displayed open contempt. He would sometimes deliberately schedule important meetings for early morning, then appear hours late, if at all. He humiliated senators by forcing them to run alongside his litter in their formal robes. On one occasion, he reportedly appointed his favorite horse, Incitatus, to the Senate, though modern historians debate whether this was literal or merely sarcastic mockery of the political body. The story of Incitatus reveals much about Caligula's evolving tyranny. The horse wasn't just well cared for. He was living performance art designed to demonstrate that the emperor's whims outweighed all tradition and reason. Incitatus lived in a marble stall with an ivory manger, wore purple blankets, a color reserved for royalty, and had his own house with servants. Caligula allegedly planned to make him consul, the highest political office in Rome. Whether serious or not, the message was clear. The institutions of state were now playthings for imperial amusement. His cruelty became more systematic and creative. He revived Tiberius's network of informers, encouraging citizens to denounce each other for rewards. Executions became increasingly common and theatrical. Victims might be killed slowly with multiple small wounds, or forced to reenact mythological scenes where they were actually killed. A man being sacrificed to the gods might actually be butchered on the altar. Gladiatorial games became bloodier, with Caligula sometimes ordering entire sections of the audience into the arena when he felt they weren't enthusiastic enough. Perhaps most telling was his treatment of his family. He forced his father-in-law, Marcus Junius Silanus, to commit suicide. He exiled his sisters Agrippina, the younger, and Julia Livilla for allegedly plotting against him. He even had his cousin Tiberius Gemellus executed, the young man he had earlier adopted as his heir. The pattern was clear. Anyone with potential claim to power, no matter how tenuous, became a target. The psychological underpinnings of this behavior suggest a man profoundly damaged by his traumatic childhood. Having witnessed the systematic destruction of his own family, he seemed determined to destroy any potential threats preemptively. Having learned that trust was dangerous, he now trusted no one. Having seen how power could be used to destroy, he now wielded it with the same brutality that had victimized his youth. His religious mania intensified throughout this period. He began appearing in public dressed as various gods, sometimes as Hercules with a lion skin and club, other times as Bacchus with grapevines in his hair, most frequently as Jupiter with a fake thunderbolt. He ordered temples built to his own divinity and demanded that sacrifices be made to his statue. When the Jewish community in Alexandria refused to worship him, it sparked violent pogroms that required imperial intervention. The most dramatic manifestation of his god complex came when he announced his intention to bridge the Bay of Baiae, a distance of over 3 kilometers between Baiae and Puteoli. In Roman times, this was an engineering project comparable to landing on the moon today. He ordered merchant ships from throughout the Mediterranean to be brought to the bay, where they were anchored in parallel lines and covered with dirt to create a temporary floating causeway. For 2 days, Caligula rode back and forth across this bridge on his warhorse, wearing the breastplate of Alexander the Great and declaring he had conquered the sea itself. The spectacle consumed enormous resources at a time when the treasury was already strained, serving no practical purpose beyond satisfying the emperor's delusions of grandeur. To many observers, it was the clearest evidence yet that Rome was being ruled by a madman. By the end of 39 AD, just 2 years after his accession, Caligula had alienated almost every segment of Roman society. The common people who had adored him were suffering under new taxes. The aristocracy lived in terror of arbitrary execution. The military leadership resented his erratic behavior and wasteful spending. The treasury was nearly empty despite massive confiscations and new taxes. And the emperor himself seemed increasingly detached from reality, surrounded by sycophants who encouraged his worst impulses while secretly plotting against him. The stage was set for confrontation. In early 40 AD, Caligula would take his divine pretensions to their logical conclusion, creating a crisis that would threaten the stability of the entire empire and ultimately seal his fate. The viper that Tiberius had nurtured was now poisoning everything it touched, and Rome was running out of antidotes. The year 39 AD marked the point of no return in Caligula's transformation from troubled ruler to full-blown tyrant. His behavior escalated from eccentric to genuinely terrifying, crossing constitutional, religious, and psychological boundaries that no Roman emperor had breached before. The first and most shocking manifestation was his escalating divine pretensions, which evolved from political theater into what appeared to be genuine delusion. It began with subtle shifts in language, speaking of his miraculous recovery from illness as evidence of divine favor. But within months, he was regularly appearing in public dressed as various deities. He would host state banquets dressed as Venus in women's clothing and jewels, or preside over legal proceedings as Jupiter complete with a handmade thunderbolt. Initially, many Romans dismissed this as the theatrical excess of a young emperor, but soon it became clear this was something darker. Courtiers reported that Caligula genuinely believed he was transforming into a living god, often spending hours staring at his reflection and conversing with the moon. His most audacious act of divine pretension came when he ordered the construction of a temporary bridge across the Bay of Bight in the spring of 39 AD. This wasn't merely an engineering project, it spanned over 3 kilometers of open sea, a distance considered impossible to bridge in Roman times. He commandeered every available merchant vessel from Egypt to Spain, anchoring them in parallel lines, and covering them with earth and wooden planks to create a floating roadway. The economic impact was devastating. Mediterranean trade virtually ceased for weeks. For 2 spectacular days, he rowed back and forth across this impossible bridge wearing Alexander the Great's actual breastplate, which he had removed from the conqueror's tomb, declaring to the assembled crowds that he had conquered the sea itself. The resources wasted were staggering, the purpose purely symbolic, a dramatic demonstration that even nature's laws must bow to his will. Meanwhile, his relationship with the Senate descended into pure psychological torture. He revived the ancient practice of proskynesis, requiring senators to grovel before him as Eastern subjects did before their kings. He would schedule dawn meetings about critical state matters, then appear hours late if he appeared at all, often drunk or in costume. Elderly senators in their 60s and 70s were forced to run alongside his litter in their formal robes for miles. He converted portions of the imperial palace into both a brothel and casino, compelling aristocrats to work as dealers and their wives to serve as attendants. The humiliation was systematic and deliberate. The entire Roman elite existed solely for his amusement. The story of his horse Incitatus became the stuff of legend, though modern historians debate how literally to take the accounts. What's certain is that the animal received treatment better than most senators. The horse lived in marble stables with an ivory manger, wore purple blankets, the color reserved for emperors, and had his own household of servants to attend to his every need. Caligula would host state dinners where Incitatus was the guest of honor, with the horse invited to dine from golden troughs. The most controversial account claims he planned to make the horse a consul, though this may have been sarcastic political commentary rather than literal intention. Regardless, the message was received. Roman institutions meant nothing against imperial whims. His financial recklessness reached epic proportions. The vast treasury of 2.7 billion sesterces that Tiberius had accumulated over 23 years was nearly exhausted within Caligula's first 18 months. He imposed increasingly bizarre taxes, a 5% levy on all food sold in markets, a tax on court lawsuits regardless of outcome, and even a tax on prostitutes' earnings, while simultaneously employing senators' wives in his palace brothel. When these measures failed to replenish the coffers, he revived the treason trials his predecessor had used so effectively, confiscating the estates of wealthy citizens on fabricated charges. One notable victim was his own cousin and former heir, Gaius Germanicus, executed for allegedly plotting against him. The cruelty became more inventive and psychologically complex. He seemed to particularly enjoy the banquet of death, inviting someone to an intimate dinner, showering them with compliments and promises of promotion, then having them executed the following morning. He forced fathers to watch their sons' executions, then invited them to dinner the same evening, expecting them to joke and laugh as if nothing had happened. At gladiatorial games, If he felt the crowd wasn't sufficiently enthusiastic, he would order entire sections of spectators into the arena to be mauled by animals. His religious mania created international crisis. In Alexandria, his demand that Jews worship his statue sparked violent pogroms that required military intervention. In Rome, he ordered the heads removed from statues of Jupiter and other major deities throughout the city, replacing them with his own likeness. Most scandalously, he converted the ancient temple of Castor and Pollux in the Roman Forum into the vestibule of his own palace, literally walking through sacred space to reach his private quarters. The family pattern continued tragically. His sisters Agrippina, the younger, and Julia Livilla were exiled for alleged conspiracy in 39 AD. His father-in-law Marcus Silanus, former governor of Syria, was forced to commit suicide by opening his veins. Even his wife Caesonia, whom he seemed to genuinely love in his twisted way, wasn't safe. He would parade her naked before his friends to demonstrate her beauty, then casually mention he could have her executed if she ever displeased him. By early 40 AD, Caligula had systematically alienated every segment of Roman society. The common people suffered under new taxes and grain shortages. The aristocracy lived in constant terror. The military leadership resented his wastefulness and mockery of their traditions, and the treasury was empty despite massive confiscations. His most loyal protectors remained his German bodyguards, who appreciated his military background and generous bonuses, but even their loyalty had limits. The final breaking point for many came during his aborted invasion of Britain in 40 AD. After assembling the largest military force since Augustus's time at the English Channel, he marched the troops to the beach, had them collect seashells as spoils of the conquered ocean, then declared victory, and returned to Rome to celebrate a triumph. To the military establishment, this was incontrovertible proof their emperor was not just cruel or eccentric, but dangerously mad. The conspiracy that would end his life began taking definitive shape in late 40 AD. It involved not only senators he had humiliated, but crucially, officers of the Praetorian Guard who had once protected him. The man who had survived the destruction of his entire family through careful dissimulation was about to discover that the same skills of deception could be turned against him by those he trusted most. The viper who had escaped the wolf's den now found himself surrounded by other snakes, all preparing to strike at the first opportunity. The January air of 41 AD carried an unusual chill through Rome's marble corridors, a physical manifestation of the political frost that had settled over the Palatine Hill. Caligula's 4-year reign had achieved what seemed impossible, uniting every segment of Roman society against him. Senators smarted from daily humiliations. Praetorian guards resented his erratic leadership. The common people groaned under oppressive taxes, and even his own family members watched him with terror-filled eyes. The emperor who had entered Rome to cheering crowds now presided over a city waiting to exhale. The conspiracy that would end this nightmare took shape in the most unlikely places: in barracks where hardened soldiers whispered of honor betrayed, in senatorial homes where Rome's elite plotted restoration, and even within palace walls where court officials calculated survival. At its core stood Cassius Chaerea, a tribune of the Praetorian Guard whose personal humiliation had become emblematic of Caligula's reign. The emperor had developed a cruel habit of assigning him feminine passwords like Venus or Priapus, mocking the veteran's voice in front of his troops. For a Roman military man, this was more than insult. It was a death sentence for his authority. The plot crystallized around the approaching Palatine Games of January 24th. The festival's chaos would provide perfect cover, its crowds masking movements, its celebrations muffling sounds of struggle. The conspirators represented a cross-section of Roman power. Praetorian officers including Tribune Cornelius Sabinus, senators like Marcus Vinicius, whose wife Caligula had stolen, and even some German bodyguards who had grown disillusioned with the emperor they were sworn to protect. That fateful morning dawned with ironic normalcy. Caligula seemed in unusually high spirits, having dismissed a troubling dream where Jupiter kicked him from heaven's throne. He attended morning sacrifices where the entrails repeatedly warned of danger signs a more cautious ruler would have heeded. But Caligula, increasingly detached from reality, joked about the warnings and proceeded to the theater. Around the 7th hour, as the emperor walked through the covered cryptoporticus connecting palace buildings, the conspirators sprang their trap. The scene that unfolded was both meticulously planned and brutally chaotic. Charia approached first, demanding the day's password. When Caligula gave another insult, tradition says, Jupiter, Charia shouted, "Accipe ratum! Take that for real!" and struck the first blow to the neck. What followed was a frenzy of violence that shocked even its participants. Dozens of conspirators descended, stabbing repeatedly in a bloodlust that saw them wounding each other in the process. The historian Josephus records some tasting Caligula's blood. Such was their hatred. The emperor's last words, according to Suetonius, were, "I still live," a defiant cry cut short by 30 wounds. Chaos erupted instantly. The German bodyguards, arriving moments late, flew into a berserker rage, killing conspirators and innocent bystanders alike. Senators initially rejoiced, believing the Republic restored. The common people rioted in confused anger. And in a nearby chamber, the Praetorian Guard made a discovery that would change history. Claudius, Caligula's 50-year-old uncle, trembling behind a curtain. The soldiers' decision to proclaim Claudius emperor was both pragmatic and revolutionary. They saw in the stammering scholar a pliable ruler who would reward their loyalty. In that moment, the Praetorian Guard discovered they could make and unmake emperors a precedent that would haunt Rome for centuries. The aftermath was as brutal as the assassination itself. Caligula's wife Caesonia was murdered within hours. Their infant daughter Julia Drusilla killed when a soldier smashed her head against a wall. The conspiracy's leaders initially enjoyed popular support, but the new emperor Claudius quickly orchestrated their executions to secure his throne. Caligula's body received hurried, secret burial, cremated, and interred in a shallow grave by loyal servants. His sisters would later rebury him properly, but the location remained secret to prevent desecration. The Senate officially condemned his memory, ordering his statues destroyed and name erased from monuments in the practice of damnatio memoriae. The assassination revealed fundamental truths about imperial power. An emperor who lost military support became vulnerable. The Praetorian Guard's role as both kingmakers and kingbreakers established a dangerous dynamic. And the Senate's inability to restore the Republic showed how permanently power had shifted from political institutions to military force. Historians still debate Caligula's mental state. Was he truly insane, or a product of childhood trauma who learned too well Rome's lessons of cruelty? Modern analysis suggests possible encephalitis from his illness, or perhaps temporal lobe epilepsy explaining his grandiose delusions. But his reign stands as eternal warning about absolute power's corrupting influence, how a ruler unchecked can transform from hope to horror in 4 short years. The legacy of those years shaped imperial governance forever. Future emperors studied Caligula's reign as a manual of what to avoid. Tiberius Claudius Drusus, the fool, who became emperor almost by accident, would spend his reign trying to stabilize the system his nephew nearly destroyed. But for Romans who lived through those terrifying years, the memory of the god emperor who thought he could command the tides would never fully fade, a cautionary tale written in blood on palace marble. The stabbing blades that ended Caligula's life in the palace corridor did not bring immediate peace to Rome. Instead, they unleashed a tidal wave of chaos that threatened to tear the empire apart. In the immediate moments following the assassination, the Palatine Hill descended into a scene of primal violence and confusion that revealed just how fragile Roman political stability had become under the young emperor's mad reign. As Caligula's body lay bleeding on the marble floor, his German bodyguards erupted in a frenzy of grief and rage. These battle-hardened warriors from beyond the Rhine had formed the emperor's personal guard, bound to him by personal loyalty rather than political calculation. Unlike the Praetorians who concerned themselves with imperial politics, the Germans responded with pure, undiluted violence. They surged through the palace complex, killing anyone they encountered: conspirators, innocent court officials, and even senators who had the misfortune of being nearby. The historian Josephus describes how they cut down men like mad dogs, their axes and swords creating a slaughterhouse in the very heart of Roman power. Meanwhile, in the Senate House, a different drama unfolded. News of the assassination reached the senators as they were preparing for the Palatine Games. At first, there was disbelief, then cautious celebration. For many aristocrats, this represented their long-awaited opportunity to restore the Republic. Senators like Valerius Asiaticus and Annius Vinicius saw this as their moment to undo the work of Augustus and return power to the traditional oligarchy. They began giving impassioned speeches about liberty and the restoration of constitutional government. But their celebration was premature. They had fundamentally misread where true power now lay in Rome. While senators debated restoring the Republic, the Praetorian Guard was making history in a most unexpected way. Soldiers searching the palace for remaining members of the imperial family found Caligula's uncle Claudius hiding behind a curtain in the Hermaeum. The 50-year-old Claudius presented a pitiable figure, stammering, trembling, and convinced he was about to be executed. For his entire life, he had been the family embarrassment, kept away from public view due to his physical disabilities and supposed mental slowness. His own mother Antonia had called him a monster of a man, not finished but merely begun by nature. But the Praetorians saw something else entirely. They recognized that Claudius, as the brother of Germanicus and uncle of Caligula, had the bloodline the Roman people respected. More importantly, they saw a man who would be deeply indebted to them for his position. In that moment, the guards made him emperor not because of his qualifications, but precisely because of his weaknesses. They carried him to their camp on their shoulders, a symbolic act that demonstrated military power now trumped senatorial authority. The days that followed saw brutal political calculations unfold. Claudius, despite his reputation as a fool, proved surprisingly adept at navigating the crisis. He promised the Praetorians a massive donative of 15,000 sesterces each the first time guardsmen were paid to support a new emperor. He then negotiated with the Senate, offering amnesty to most conspirators, while ensuring the execution of Caligula's actual murderers. Cassius Chaerea and his fellow assassins learned the hard way that killing a tyrant doesn't always make one a hero, sometimes it just makes one a problem for the next administration. The systematic eradication of Caligula's memory began almost immediately. The Senate officially decreed damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory. Across the empire, workers began chiseling Caligula's name from monuments and inscriptions. Statues were melted down or reworked into images of other emperors. Official records were purged of his acts. The message was clear. Rome wanted to forget the nightmare of the last 4 years. But the psychological impact proved harder to erase. Caligula's reign demonstrated several terrifying truths about the imperial system. First, it showed that the mechanisms Augustus had created to prevent tyranny were inadequate against a determined autocrat. Second, it revealed that the military, particularly the Praetorian Guard, now held the ultimate power in determining who ruled Rome. Third, it established that an emperor could behave with apparent madness and still maintain power as long as he kept the military paid and the people entertained. Historians have debated Caligula's mental state for 2 millennia. Ancient sources like Suetonius and Dio Cassius present him as fundamentally insane, pointing to his apparent conversations with the moon, his appointment of his horse to political office, and his belief in his own divinity. Modern scholars have suggested various medical explanations, perhaps temporal lobe epilepsy exacerbated by a serious illness in 37 AD, or maybe schizophrenia that developed in his mid-20s. Others argue that his behavior was rational within the context of his traumatic childhood, a boy who witnessed the systematic destruction of his family, learning that only absolute power and absolute cruelty could ensure survival. What remains undeniable is the transformative impact of his reign on Roman politics. Future emperors studied Caligula's rule as a cautionary tale. The sensible Vespasian, coming to power 30 years later, reportedly kept a list of Caligula's mistakes that he consulted regularly. The philosophical Marcus Aurelius would later write about the importance of resisting the temptations of absolute power, with Caligula's example clearly in mind. For the Roman people, the Caligula years became a benchmark for terror. When later emperors, like Domitian or Commodus, behaved tyrannically, Romans would whisper that another Caligula had come to power. The memory of those 4 years served as a permanent reminder of how quickly civilized governance could descend into nightmare. Perhaps most significantly, Caligula's reign demonstrated the complete failure of the Augustan system to handle incompetent or insane rulers. The mechanisms that worked well under a capable leader like Augustus collapsed entirely under someone like Caligula. This fundamental flaw in the imperial system would haunt Rome for centuries, leading eventually to the crisis of the 3rd century, when the empire nearly collapsed under a series of similarly unstable rulers. As Rome moved forward under the surprisingly competent rule of Claudius, the ghost of his nephew served as a silent warning. The palace corridors where Caligula had been murdered became places of superstitious dread. The stories of his cruelties became campfire tales. And the question of how to prevent another such emperor became the central constitutional problem that Rome would never satisfactorily solve. The boy who had grown up in army camps, the young man who had survived the snake pit of Capri, the emperor who had believed himself a god, all that remained was a cautionary tale and a bloodstain on marble, reminders of how quickly genius could curdle into madness when given absolute power. The blood had been scrubbed from the palace floors, the conspirators executed or rewarded, and a new emperor sat on the throne. But Caligula's ghost continued to haunt the Roman imagination. In the months and years that followed his assassination, a curious phenomenon occurred. The mad emperor began transforming from a recent nightmare into a legendary cautionary tale, his story taking on mythological proportions that would resonate through 2 millennia of Western history. The immediate political legacy was clear. The Praetorian Guard had discovered its king-making power. By plucking Claudius from behind a curtain and proclaiming him emperor, the guards established a dangerous precedent that would shape Roman politics for centuries. Future emperors would learn that their survival depended less on senatorial approval or popular support than on keeping the military, particularly the Praetorians, satisfied. This shift in power dynamics would culminate in the year of the 4 emperors, 69 AD, and later the crisis of the 3rd century, where emperors rose and fell at the point of a sword. Caligula's reign also forced a fundamental rethinking of the imperial system itself. Augustus had created a delicate balance of power that maintained the fiction of republican government while concentrating actual authority in the emperor's hands. Caligula demonstrated how easily this system could be abused when someone refused to play by its unwritten rules. Subsequent emperors, particularly the Flavians, would work to create more formal structures of imperial administration that could function even with a mediocre or disengaged ruler. The psychological impact on the Roman ruling class was profound and lasting. Senators who had survived Caligula's reign developed what might be called imperial trauma, a deep-seated understanding that their lives and property depended entirely on the emperor's whims. This created a culture of sycophancy and caution that would characterize senatorial behavior for generations. The bold, independent aristocrats of the late Republic had been replaced by cautious courtiers who measured their words and watched their backs. As decades passed, Caligula's story began evolving in the Roman consciousness. Within a generation, he had become a stock character in philosophical treatises about tyranny. Stoic philosophers like Seneca, who had witnessed his reign firsthand, used Caligula as the ultimate example of what happens when power corrupts absolutely. In Seneca's moral essays, Caligula appears repeatedly as the embodiment of uncontrolled passion, and hubris a walking lesson in why virtue must guide power. By the time Suetonius came to write his famous biography in the early 2nd century, Caligula had already passed into legend. Suetonius collected every scandalous anecdote he could find, creating a portrait so extreme that some modern historians have questioned its reliability. The Caligula of Suetonius' pages is less a historical figure than a mythological monster, a composite of every Roman fear about absolute power gone wrong. He becomes the emperor who made his horse a consul, who declared war on Neptune, who committed incest with his sisters, the ultimate symbol of imperial excess. This legendary Caligula proved incredibly durable through subsequent centuries. During the Enlightenment, philosophers like Voltaire pointed to Caligula as evidence of the dangers of unchecked monarchy. In the modern era, he became a favorite subject for psychologists trying to understand the relationship between power and madness. Freudian analysts saw in his story classic examples of the Oedipus complex and narcissistic personality disorder. The 20th century brought new interpretations, particularly as historians began re-examining the ancient sources with more critical eyes. The publication of the Acts of the Alexandrian Martyrs and other documentary evidence from Egypt suggested that Caligula's administration might have been more competent than the literary sources indicate. Some revisionist historians, like Alois Winterling in his 2003 biography, have argued that Caligula wasn't insane at all, but rather a radical traditionalist whose actions were calculated to break the power of the senatorial aristocracy. The archaeological record provides tantalizing clues that complicate the traditional narrative. Caligula's name appears on numerous public works projects throughout the empire, suggesting he continued the infrastructural programs of his predecessors. Coin evidence shows he maintained the silver content of the denarius, indicating some fiscal responsibility despite the stories of wild spending. The famous Nemi ships, recovered from Lake Nemi in the 1930s, demonstrate sophisticated Roman engineering that doesn't align with the picture of a completely deranged ruler. Modern psychology has offered more nuanced explanations for his behavior. The trauma of witnessing his family's destruction, combined with what might have been temporal lobe epilepsy or encephalitis, could explain both his paranoia and his delusions of grandeur. Rather than simple madness, we might be seeing the complex interplay of childhood trauma, neurological condition, and the corrupting influence of absolute power. In popular culture, Caligula has proven endlessly fascinating. From the infamous 1979 film to numerous novels and television series, he remains the go-to example of ancient decadence and tyranny. This popular image often obscures the historical reality, reducing a complex figure to a simple monster. Yet the persistence of this fascination speaks to something fundamental in his story, the terrifying possibility that the line between civilized governance and barbaric tyranny can be shockingly thin. For historians, Caligula's reign poses fundamental methodological questions. How do we reconstruct a historical figure when our main sources are so clearly biased? How do we separate the man from the myth? The challenge is particularly acute because the senatorial class that produced our literary sources had every reason to portray Caligula in the worst possible light. Their survival depended on convincing subsequent emperors that they had been victims rather than collaborators. The most lasting legacy of Caligula's reign may be what it reveals about the nature of historical memory itself. The Caligula we know is not just the historical figure who ruled from 37 to 41 AD, but the composite of 2,000 years of retelling, reinterpreting, and reimagining. He exists at the intersection of history and mythology, a cautionary tale that continues to evolve with each generation that rediscover his story. As we look back from the 21st century, Caligula's reign raises questions that remain disturbingly relevant. How do societies hold powerful leaders accountable? What safeguards can prevent the abuse of absolute power? How do we distinguish between political unconventionality and genuine madness in our rulers? The boy who started life as Little Boots in German military camps became, in death, an eternal warning about the corrupting nature of power, a warning that echoes across centuries to our own time. The blood may have been washed away, the statues melted down, the name erased from monuments, but Caligula's ghost still walks the halls of power wherever one person's whim becomes another's law. His story endures not because it's unique, but because it represents the terrifying potential in every system of absolute power, the possibility that the person wearing the crown might be the last to know they'd gone mad.